In part one of this series of videos on black and white toning, we added some tone using a solid color adjustment layer and a tonal range mask. So we're getting the tone applied mostly in the shadows, a little bit in the midtones, and not very much in the highlights. That very well replicates what we do when we tone something in the darkroom with sepia toner. It takes very much to the silver particles in the shadows and midtones and not so much in the highlights where there isn't any silver, and those highlights look nice and clear and bright white. What if we wanted to have a little bit of a split tone? We want to have maybe warmth in the shadows, but maybe a little bit of coolness in the upper midtones like a selenium tone print would have. What I'm going to do now is go from this image that already has the tone in the shadows and add another layer that will bring a different color into the highlights, and then we'll learn how to control that better. So I'm going to go back to channels like we did before, and I'm going to command click on the RGB channel. And we might remember that this is going to give us a a highlight-based selection to start with. So now we have the highlights selected. In the last demo, we inverted this to become a shadow-based selection. This time I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave this as a highlight-based selection. I'm now going to click back to the Layers tab, and I'm going to create a new solid color adjustment layer. So if you look at our different adjustment layer functions, I'm going to go to solid color. And this time I'm going to create a color that's a little bit more in the cooler range, so maybe like a little bit of a blue, almost kind of cyan blue, very light colored. And you can see that appearing in the image. It's going to look a lot different in a minute. I'm going to go to OK, and I'm going to switch my blending mode from normal to multiply. The problem is with this is that I like maybe what's happening in some of the midtones. I definitely don't like what's happening in the highlights, where all the highlights look rather blue. So how do I get this tonal range masking to affect the midtones but not affect the highlights, the brightest highlights so much? Well, what we're going to do is an odd little thing here. We're going to select the mask, this mask which was created by that initial highlight-based selection that we created. I'm now going to run a curve on the mask. I can't create a curves layer to simply affect just that mask, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the image menu, to adjustments and curves. And I have to be selected on that mask when I do this, which I am. And I'm going to say, okay, I want that curve to be real bright in the midtones, and I'm going to take the highlights and make the highlights really dark. In other words, wherever this mask is dark, I'm not going to see the effect of this layer because it's a mask. So if I make the region of highlights, which is this upper range of tones, if I make this region dark by taking the white point all the way down, I'm preventing that blue of the solid color adjustment layer from being seen in these highlights. I can also control like how much do I want it to show even in the shadows by moving the black point on over. And then I can also try moving this kind of midpoint up and down. But somewhere right around there, I like what I'm seeing. I think it's a little too strong. I might reduce the opacity of that layer. I might reduce the saturation of that color. But I like how it's kind of petering out in the highlights a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and click OK and go back to this layer. I can either double click into the color picker and reduce the saturation of that color right there. I could also go to the opacity of that layer and decide that I want to see less of that tone or none of that tone. So again, I'm using a combination of tonal range masking, a solid color adjustment layer, and then I can alter that color further by either altering the color in the color picker or reducing the opacity of that layer. And so now what I've got is a really nice little split tone. I might even try to warm up the underlying shadow tones a little bit, maybe go just push those a little bit more toward red. This is going to give me a real strong selenium looking split tone with a reddish, ruddy red, reddish kind of tone in the shadows and a little bit of a coolness in those highlights. the upper midtones, I should say. All right, and in part 3, I'll show you another way that you can do a split toning using the duotone function in Photoshop.